Welcome back to another module with me, Max. In this module, we'll dive into the CSS Grid, a technology which allows us to create highly customizable, more complex page layouts. Now, in the last module, Manuel walked you through CSS Flexbox, which also is related to laying things out and positioning things. And therefore, in this module, we will not only learn CSS Grid, but of course, I'll also dive into how it relates to Flexbox and when you may use which. To be precise, in this module, we'll first of all dive into what CSS Grid is in detail. Then we'll have a look at the different properties and values that are connected to the CSS Grid concept. And there are a lot, as you will learn, so we'll learn a lot in this module. And as I just mentioned, I'll also clarify when you should use Grid and when you may use Flexbox and how the two relate. And with that, let's dive right into it and let's get started with understanding what the CSS Grid really is and how it helps us. So what is the CSS Grid? Let's consider a normal web page like this one, where we have a couple of different elements or areas. We may have a header, sidebar, the main content with some elements, and a footer, let's say. Now, if we look close, we could divide this up into a grid of rows and columns. So like this. And of course, we have more than one row and one column. We could think of this page being structured along this grid. And actually, this is how you work in many design tools like Sketch and so on, where you can also use a grid to position elements. Or when you work with CSS frameworks like Bootstrap, they also always ship with a grid, which makes the positioning of elements easier. Because positioning elements on the page in the place where you want them to have is one of the most difficult or complex features you have in CSS, and the CSS Grid is another tool which aims to help you with that. It allows you to define such a grid of rows and columns and to then specify which element should be positioned where. And it's really flexible about all of that, as you will learn. So let's dive into it and let's start creating a simple grid. To build a simple grid, attached to this video, you find this very simple starting project. Now, why am I not working in our main course project? We will work on that later in this module again, but the CSS Grid has so many different properties and features, it would really be forced to put it all into the context of the course project, and we would have many distracting side effects. That is why we will work with this simple layout here, where we have a wrapping div and then some child elements, which we can use to learn about all the features the grid offers. And then again, we will apply some of these concepts to our course project so that you also see it in action. Now in that main.css file which we're importing, I right now only define a margin on the container to put it a little bit further into the page and have it not sit directly on the edges of the page. And each element, each child element, has a distinct background color so that we can quickly tell them apart. If we have a look at this page, this is what it looks like. And here I actually opened it in Firefox because Firefox has very decent CSS Grid debugging utilities, which make it easier for me to explain it and to show some concepts. So you can of course also use it in Chrome. Chrome supports the CSS Grid, but Firefox makes learning it and diving into what happens behind the scenes a bit easier. Now that I mentioned it, Chrome supports the grid. Let's check the general grid support. If we check caniuse.com, we see that modern browsers support the grid pretty well. We do have problems in the Internet Explorer, especially in older versions, and that's something you have to keep in mind. If you work with the CSS Grid, you can't support older Internet Explorer versions. So if that is something your page needs to support, the CSS Grid might not be your first choice. If you support more modern browsers, you're definitely free to use it though. With that out of the way, let's dive into our demo project here and let's start turning this into a grid. And then I'll also show you how we can debug it with these Firefox developer tools. So let's start turning this into a grid. If we go back to the HTML file real quick, we see we got this wrapping container, and this container holds all the other divs. Now we can turn this container into a grid by setting the display property to grid. Now you learned that we can set it to inline, block, non, inline block, flex. Grid is just another option. And with that, the container element becomes a CSS grid, and the elements inside of it, so these 4 divs, are then positioned within the grid. And with no further settings, as we have it here, some default settings will kick in. Let's have a look. If I now reload the page, nothing changes. The elements look exactly the way they did before. However, if we inspect this here in the developer tools, this div, we can see the display grid is taking effect. It even gives us this grid icon. And if we click that icon, we also see something. It may be a bit hard to see here, but if you do it in your browser, you should see that by clicking on that, some helpful lines are added. We got purple lines around the block, dotted lines to the right and bottom and between the different elements, and solid lines on the left and top. And if you click on the layout ribbon here, you can customize this. You can click on that color icon here, for example, and set this to a different color, which you maybe can see a bit easier, whatever your requirements are. And you can also check these items here on the right to see more information, like line numbers, something I'll come back to, area names, where we don't see an effect right now, but I'll also come back to that, and this feature, which is really useful, to extend lines infinitely. If you check it, then the lines don't end after the grid container, but they continue thereafter, which makes it easier to see them, especially when you have elements with a solid background, as in our case here. You also see in the developer tools this demo grid here, where you can also highlight the different, let's call it, cells. And on the left, you then see that it's highlighted there too if I hover over them here on the right. Now that is really useful because this already shows us that a grid was created, and right now it has one column, only one column, but 4 rows. 1 row for each element. And that's just because the default behavior for an element with display grid is if no other settings are set, then it will create only 1 column and as many rows as we have child elements. And if one of these divs had a nested child element, then only the wrapping div, so L2 let's say, gets its own row. The nested elements inside of L2 or any other div would not be part of the grid. So only direct children are part of the grid, so to say, or are considered by the row generation mechanism. So this is our demo grid, our first simple grid. Now in the next lecture, we'll dive a bit deeper into this and see what else we can do with that. So with the dummy grid created, let's change these defaults to see what we can do with the grid. Now, to customize this grid, let's go back to our CSS code. And on the container where we have display grid, we can now add a special grid-related property, the grid template columns property. This allows us to override of only having 1 column and to add multiple columns to the grid. Now, how do we add columns? You don't enter 3 for 3 columns. Instead, you can set the widths of the columns. So what we could do is we could set 200 pixels for the first column and then add a second column by simply specifying a second value, like 150 pixels. And maybe a third column, which could also be 20% of the surrounding container, so of the grid container. So now we would get 3 columns where the first 2 columns have absolute values, and you could use rem or m here too, and where the third column has a relative value, percentage, of the grid container, which is a block level element and therefore which by default has 100% of the width of its surrounding container, which in our case is the body. So if we save this and we reload, now something changed. We still see the helper lines, which is really useful. And we can see, both here on the left as well as on the right in the developer tools, that we got 3 columns here. These are the 3 columns we created. You can see they have different sizes. The last column has 20% of the container size. The middle column is 150 pixels. And the pixel sizes here in the preview or on our page simply aren't correct because I'm zoomed in so that you can see it a bit easier. So this would be 150 pixels if we were at 100% scale. And on the very left, well, there we got our 200 pixels. And since I got a zoom factor of 240, well, this leads to 480 in translated pixels. But it is our defined size of 200 pixels in the end. Now, another unit we can use in a grid, a special unit, is fraction. We can also add a fourth column with one fraction, fr. And this will split up the remaining space, which is 100% minus 20% minus 200 pixels minus 150 pixels. It will take the remaining space, and if we had more than one column with the fraction unit, it would split the remaining space between all columns with fraction, and the number indicates the relation. So if I replace 150 pixels with 2 fraction, then the remaining space, so 100% minus 20% minus 200 pixels, the remaining space would be split up between column 2 and column 4, and column 2 would receive twice as much space as column 4 does. If I save this and reload, now you see column 2 and column 4 are the fraction columns, and column 2 indeed is twice as big as column 4 is. Now, one important note here, you can now also see that we got a solid line on the right of the grid. Previously here, this purple line was dotted. Solid lines mark the end or beginning of the grid rows and columns. And since we explicitly state columns here, there is no inferred width or inferred amount of columns or rows, and therefore the grid clearly ends after the solid line. To the bottom, we still have a dotted line for the row because it will still keep the flexibility of adding more rows if needed because we haven't defined the rows explicitly. We can do that though by going there and adding grid template rows. And there we could say the first row should have, let's say, 5 rem, and the second row should have 2.5 rem. Now we add 2 rows, and if I save and reload, what we can see is that the first row increased in height because we set it to 5 rem, and we get a second row which holds no content because we only got 4 elements, and we now got 8 cells, 4 columns and 2 rows. But the second row is actually there, and we can see it in the preview. We now got a solid line at the bottom which marks that the grid indeed is enclosed by these 4 solid lines. Now, as a side note, if you would add more than 8 elements, it would still create the 9th and so on element in a newly added row, so it keeps that flexibility of growing if needed. But that simply means that we got clearly defined sizes for 2 rows, and any other row would then again fall back to the defaults. And I will show you how to override these defaults later in the module 2. But let's not get too advanced regarding that right now. Let's focus on what we got, and that is a working grid where we can already see that we seem to have 8 cells and that we seem to automatically position the elements there. Now, time to work on that positioning, because wouldn't it be helpful if we could, for example, let element 3 take more than 1 cell, because maybe it should overlap 2 cells? We'll dive into that in the next lecture. So we created our grid with 8 cells, and right now every child element of the container takes 1 cell. Now, it would be nice if we could override that default positioning. And let's say element 3 should actually take the last 2 cells in the first row. So it should take the cell where element 4 is in 2. We can override this by going to the child selector now. So L3 selects the element 3 here. And there, we can define where it should be positioned. We do this with the help of the grid column start property, for example. Do you remember that setting in the developer tools I showed you earlier? display line numbers, CSS Grid actually thinks in lines. The grid is constructed by automatically adding a couple of lines before and after our columns and rows. So the first horizontal line here marks the beginning of the first row. The second one marks the end of the first row, and the third one marks the end of the last row. And the same for the columns. Now, if we want to tell element 3 to start at line number 3, well, then we can simply set grid column start to 3. This is line number 3, and the developer tools of Firefox help us identifying this number. Now, we of course want to also tell it where to end, and this is the interesting part now, because by default this is set to, well, simply span one cell. Now we can set this to end at line number 5, so column line number 5, which we simply do by typing a 5 here. If we now save that and reload, we see something interesting. Element number 4 jumps into a new row because its old place is taken by element number 3, which we clearly define to go into these 2 cells. Now, due to the helper lines and our preview at the bottom, you can still see that actually we got 2 cells here. But because of grid column start and end, we define that this element should take them both. We also see that if we hover over it here, it takes both. The same can be said for the rows. We can set grid row start to the row number it should start in. In our example, this would be 1. So let's set it to 1. Now, if we want to force the green element, element 3, to go all the way to the bottom here, so to the end of row number 2, then we have to set a grid row end property of 3, because the last line here in the row category, so the last row line, is line number 3. With that, if we save that and we reload the page, now element 3 takes this full block of 4 cells, simply due to the way we configured it. And this is how you can explicitly position elements in the grid. Now, as you can see at element 1, 2, and 4, the grid automatically positions all child elements, and it starts filling the grid at the top left and then goes to the right and to the bottom, though it will respect the browser reading settings. So if you're watching this on a right to left device, it would actually start in the top right corner. It automatically fills that, but you can override that behavior by explicitly stating a position with the help of these properties just as you need it. This is something super important to understand, how you interact between your grid elements with the positioning and the grid container where you define the layout. This is happening in 2 different places. You define the layout in the container, you define the position on the child element. Now that we positioned our first element, let's go back to the layouting. There are 2 important Aro features I want to show you right now. The first one is one additional unit or value you can use. Here we got clearly defined values for all 4 columns. Now you also got cases where you have a couple of absolute or relative non-fraction units, and you simply want to ensure that the last column or row takes the available remaining space. Now obviously you could take one fraction as a value for that, but there also is auto. So if I set the template row here to auto and I reload, then it actually is only as high as it needs to be to fit the content in. And this is generally the same behavior for the columns, though if you set it to auto there, it will simply occupy any remaining space. So if I quickly demonstrate this by setting this here, let's say back to, let's say 5 rem, and then I replace the last fraction with auto, then you actually see it takes the full available width, and the last column, which has a value of auto, is just as big as it needs to be to fill the remaining space. The same behavior would be true for rows if what? Well, if the height of the container, so of the grid container here, was set, we got no height property there, and therefore auto on the vertical axis will just take as much space as the content requires. Because there is no space to fill up, because the overall grid container is just as high as it needs to be to fit its content as defined here in the layout into itself. If we were to give that container a height of, let's say, 500 pixels, and I reload, then you see that auto actually fills that up. Now we got auto fill up the entire bottom row. If I remove auto and set this to rem instead, then you would see that the grid container still has its width, but the rows don't actually fill it up. So this is something up to you, something you can configure just as you need it. And knowing about auto and that you can conveniently use it to create or to fill the empty space is super important. Now, one other important feature is that sometimes you don't have 4 columns with such different widths. Maybe you want to have 4 columns, but they should all be equally sized. So let me quickly comment this out and duplicate it. And now let me overwrite this. And let's say we got 4 columns and each column is 25% or 10 rem or whatever you want to have. So of course what we can do is we can write 25% 4 times to create 4 columns. Because if I only write it once, we only get 1 column. So now we got 4 equally sized columns, as you can see here on the preview at the bottom right. But writing it like this, of course, is a bit annoying. There is a helper method you can use, which is called repeat. It's a CSS function, and it takes 2 arguments. The second argument is the pattern it should repeat, and the first argument is how often it should repeat it. So 4 with this pattern would actually create 16 columns, because it repeats 4 columns with that width 4 times. If I do that, we end up with 16 columns here in the bottom right, as you can see. But if we remove 3 times 25%, now we create 4 columns with 25% for each of them. So now we're back to what we had before, but with way less code to write. And as I said, this can be any pattern, doesn't have to be just one value, and doesn't have to be percentages. Could be pixels, rem, fractions and pixels mixed, whatever your requirement is. So the repeat function is a very useful function for creating grids with the layout you want quickly. There also is one other helpful function which I want to show you. Let's say here, for my template rows here, I actually want to have a certain minimum and maximum height. So what we can do for that is we can use a special function which also ships with CSS, the min-max function. This function takes 2 arguments, and the first one is the minimum, min-max, not mix, min-max. So the first value is the minimum height in this case for the row. For the column it would be the width. So the minimum height an element should have, and the second argument is the maximum height. So we could say the minimum height should be 10 pixels, maximum should be 200 pixels. If we save that and reload, then we see that for the second row, it is 200 pixels high. Again, keep in mind you have to multiply it with 2.4 because I got a zoom factor of 240. But it takes these 200 pixels. Why? Because it can do that, because we got enough height available in our grid here, so it tries to fill up as much as possible. If I were to restrict the grid height to, let's say, 200 pixels overall, then this would shrink. Now it's somewhere in between the minimum and the maximum. And if I shrink this even more, maybe because I add one more row which also requires some space, then it would go to its minimum or closer to its minimum value of 10 pixels. So min-max is another helpful function if you want to ensure that a certain cell should have a minimum width or height, but shouldn't become bigger than a certain maximum. This is just one other feature I didn't want to hide from you, so this is definitely something which can come in handy too. And of course, you can also mix and match values here too. You can mix percentages with pixels, with fractions, with auto even. So now it would not become smaller than that, but would always fill whatever is there. Otherwise, something you can see if we increase the height of the width again. So this is really something you should keep in mind and which can be very useful. Now that we have the very basics out of the way, let's work on the positioning again. Right now we only position one element, element 3, with the help of grid column start, end, and grid row start and end. We're using the line numbers right now. Now turns out we can also specify some other values there or change the way we use the line numbers. For example here, grid column start and end. Right now we're saying start at the line with the number 3 and end right before the line number 5. Nothing wrong with that. But another way of expressing this for this element would be start at line number 3 and then span 2 cells. So occupy 2 cells. And that can be done by changing the 5 in grid column end to span 2. Span is a keyword here, not something I did come up with. It's defined in the CSS specification, and it tells it to simply end after it occupies 2 cells. So if I reload, we have the same result as before, but as you can see, if we inspect element 3, we do have this rule in effect, and it just leads to the same result as before because we occupy the same amount of cells. If we say span 3 here, and we reload, we see nothing changes though because we can't go further to the right. We only got 2 columns here. We would need to define more to span more than that, or simply start earlier. If we start at line number 2 here instead of 3, and I now reload, now everything changed. Now we take 3 columns width because of span 3, and the other elements also needed to be repositioned because we now occupy, for example, the place where element 2 could be seen earlier. So span is very interesting. Now, sometimes you also have another behavior where you want to ensure that a certain value takes a full row. Now, clearly you can say start at line number 1 and then define the last number as the end number, or span 4 in our grid. But there also is another nice trick taking advantage of another way of using these elements. Let's use the element 2 for this now. And for that, I'll add a grid column start here of 1 because I want to start in the first column. And grid column end will now not be span 4, which would take the entire row. And it will not be 5, which would take the entire row, but -1. You can define negative line numbers too. And what this will lead to is simply that it starts counting from the end of the grid. So from the right here. And one number or one line from the right is just line number 5. The advantage is, of course, if we add 1 extra column to this grid, we don't need to change this line because 1 column from the right will still be 1 column from the right. If we defined a column end of 5 here and we add another column to the grid, then we would have to bump this up to 6. So this means we have to revisit this place. It's easier if we use that trick. And of course, you're not limited to -1. You could say -2 to move 2 columns in from the right, but -1 is now just to the end. Now, if we save that before a reload, there is something interesting which should happen now. Please note that I'm saying that element 2 should take the entire row, but element 3 is there already, at least partly. So what would you expect to happen? Well, let's try out. What we see is that element 2 jumps into a new line. And this cell where it previously was stays empty because there is no element we could put in there. Element 4 could be put in there, but it comes after element 2 in a DOM order and it doesn't jump ahead. So element 2 gets into a new line because it couldn't take that line as it was already partly taken by element 3. Interesting. But what if we now also set the row on element 2, so on that red element? If I set grid row start to, let's say, line number 2, and then I set grid row end to span 1, which I don't have to do, by the way. This is the default, so you can also omit this. But if I set it to be really clear about what's happening, then I'm saying the red row here, element 2, should start in this row. So it should really be in that row where the green element also is. Let's reload and see what happens. Now indeed, they overlap, as you can see. We got this area here where we have both element 2 and element 3. And that is something very important to remember. Elements can overlap. They can occupy the same cell if, and that's important, if you explicitly set this. The grid will always try to avoid this, but of course there are situations where you want to have overlapping cells, and then you can force it by clearly setting the column and row position. Now, the question is which one is on top? And the answer is the DOM order is important. Element 3 comes after element 2, and therefore element 3 is on top. We can change this with the set index though, even though we don't have position absolute, but the grid supports it. We can set the set index on element 2, which would not be on top normally, to 10, let's say. The default value of auto is equal to 0, so 10 is definitely higher. If we now reload, we see the red one is on top now. So this is something extremely useful to take away, that you got different ways of targeting starts and ends of your columns and rows, and that elements can overlap. And with that, let's dive into one other thing we can do with these line numbers. Now we saw how we can use grid column start end and grid row start and end to target the different line numbers in our grid to define where the elements should go. Now working with the line numbers, of course, is an option, but not the only one we got. It would also be nice to give our columns and rows names, or to give our column and row lines names, to be precise. And we can do that. Let's start with the rows, because we repeat the columns and there is something special about that. I'll come back to that. So let's start with the rows. If we want to name line number 1, so this first horizontal line, then we have to add the name in front of the value for the first row, so of the height of the first row. And we add the name in square brackets, that's important, this is required. And then any name of your choice. You're totally free. You shouldn't take span though, because it's a reserved word. But other than that, you're totally free. So for example here, we could name this row-1 start. However, again, the name is up to you. So row-1 start. After this first row, we name the line that comes thereafter. So line number 2, the second horizontal line. We add square brackets again, and now we can name this row-1 end. You could argue that it maybe also should be named row-2 start though, because the second line here actually is both the ending of the first row and the start of the second one. Good thing is, if you want, you can assign multiple names, simply by staying in the square brackets, adding a white space, and adding the second name, which of course is totally up to you. This is not required, you can do that. You can of course also use one name. This will refer to the same line, that's important. So you can use the two names interchangeably now. And now we can simply add another name after this additional row here. So maybe we name this row-2 end, and we could also name it row-3 start if we wanted to. So we could add row-3 start as a second name. And then we can name the last line number, which is row-3 end, for example. If you save that and you reload, you don't see the names here in the inspector, that's not displayed. We can just check if it works, because we can now reference these names instead. So in places where we refer to the row numbers, like here, grid row start, we refer to line number 2. Now, a name for line number 2 is either row-1 end or row-2 start. Let's maybe pick row-2 start, because here we're defining something which should start there. So we set this to row-2 start, without squared brackets. Now, grid row end doesn't take a line number here, because here we use the span syntax. But for example, down there on element 3, we get a grid row end of 3. Now line number 3 has the row to end name, for example. We could also use row 3 start. But let's take row to end and let's replace grid row end, or the value 3 to be precise, with row to end. Again, without square brackets here. And grid row start, of course, could be row 1 start as a name, like that. With all that added, if we save everything and we reload, we shouldn't see any changes, which is a good sign because that means it works, because we target the same lines as before, but this time with our named lines here. Back in our theory project, so to say, we learned about the basic positioning and layouting capabilities of the grid and its children. Now let's dive into some shorthands and advanced positioning features. Let's start with the shorthands. One convenient shorthand, which you probably will use quite a bit, is one which allows you to summarize the column, the grid column start and end, or the grid row start and end statements into one. You can summarize grid column start and grid column end into just grid column, and then the first value is the start value, 1, and then the second value is separated, and that's important, is separated by a slash, a forward slash, and then you simply add the end value. So this shorthand here replaces the longer version I had before. And it works exactly the same for the row. There we have grid row as our shorthand. We have the start value, which, as you see, can also be a name, and the end value, which also can be span 1. So you really enter just the same values as you did for grid row start and end, but now in this shorthand notation. If you save that and reload, you shouldn't see any changes because it is just the same in the end. It leads to the same result, but in a shorter way. There also is a shorthand which allows you to summarize all values into just one property, and that's the so-called grid area property. Now, the grid area property has a clearly defined order of values. First of all, you start with grid row start, so with this value, row 1 start in this element 3's case. So you enter row 1 start, then a forward slash, and then not, and that's important, not the end of the row, but the start of the column instead. So we had grid row start as a first value. The second value is grid column start, so 2 in this case. Then you have another forward slash, and now you add the grid row end. So grid row start, grid column start, grid row end is row 2 end in this case. And then another forward slash, and now obviously grid column end. So span 3 in this example. If we insert this and comment out the longer version, we can save that and reload, and we don't see any changes because we end up with the same grid here, just with, well, this shorthand. Now, feel free to use the in-between shorthand if this is a bit clearer to you. This one exists though, and it's of course perfectly fine to use it. May even be better, just make sure that your fellow developers are on board and also understand this. So now that we had a look at the shorthands, let's also dive into something else which is relevant for positioning: gutters between the rows and columns. Right now, all the columns and rows sit directly next to each other. There is no space in between. And even if you add a margin, let's say to element 3, margin 10 pixels, even with such a margin, you don't really change anything. The element now clearly has some distance, but if you watch the lines, they still didn't change. So we just positioned the element different inside of its marked area, and this can lead to the result we want to have, but it's not really a clean way, especially since there is a cleaner way. On the container of the grid, we can add another property, which is grid row or column gap. Grid column gap allows you to define the gaps between the columns. So this could be 20 pixels. If you do that and you reload, now you see that indeed in the preview we can see there is a gap. this still is treated as one line only, which is why the line markers are right in the middle of the gap. But we now have an official gutter between these cells. And now we don't have to set a margin on any element to get some distance between the columns in this case. Of course, if one element overlaps multiple columns, it's not kind of disturbed by these gaps. It overlaps the gaps too, which is what you would expect, I guess. You can, of course, also set a grid row gap of, let's say, 10 pixels. And now this will introduce some gaps between the rows, unsurprisingly. And there also is a shorthand. If you want to summarize this, then you can do so. You can add just grid gap. And there you first specify the row gap of 10 pixels in this case, and then the column gap. So order is important here. If you now reload, you end up with the same result. If I change the column gap to 30, you can see it has an effect. So this really is working. This is how you can conveniently add gaps. If you only specify one value here, by the way, then this will be taken for both rows and columns. So if you want to have the same distance between all elements, then this is the syntax you want to use. Now, we're already at the point where you probably will be dreaming about the grid tonight. So, time to dive even deeper. Thus far, when we wanted to position elements, like element 2 and 3, where we overrode the default positioning, we did this by going to the child and giving it a start and end row and column where, well, to tell it where it should sit. Now, this is perfectly fine, and this is an approach you will probably use a lot. However, you can also kind of reverse the process. You can divide your grid into areas, which you assign names to, and now I'm talking about the cells, not the lines, and then tell the elements which areas they should occupy. Sounds strange? Let me show you how it works. And for that, let's pick a different layout now. Let's say element 3 should take the entire first row, and we want to position it differently. So not with grid area here, but instead with this named area I was referring to. For this, we first of all remove our value for grid area, and we give it a name. Any name of your choice. Maybe header. Now here important, no square brackets, just the name. Now of course, if I reload, this leads to nothing. Now the green element is somewhere here at the bottom. So essentially our grid is just broken. How would it know what the header area is? Obviously it can't. We define these areas in our container now, so where we set display grid. There we can add a special property, grid template areas. We got columns and rows, grid template columns and grid template rows. Now with the areas property, we can give our cells in the grid a name which we can then use on our elements to position them in these marked cells. Here you pass a string as a value, so you need quotation marks. Double or single quotation marks, doesn't matter, opening and closing. And now the syntax is both easy and strange at the same time. It's easy because it's very close to how we humans think, and it's strange because it's not very close to computers normally work. You simply create your grid here with name values, with labels. So what do I mean with that? Our grid has 4 columns and it has 3 rows, right? It has 1 row, 5 rem, a second row with a dynamic value, and a third row. So our grid has 4 times 3 cells, 4 columns, and then 3 rows. Now we could normally clarify this here on our grid preview, and we can do so if I comment out grid area header on element 3 so that it doesn't get broken. Now we can verify we get 4 columns and 3 rows, so we got 12 cells. We now simply create a pattern of these columns and rows here in the string, and we give each element or each cell a name. So, like header, and important, this is the name you then use below. So header, and then we got 4 columns, so we add header, 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 and now we have a new line, and you simply create a new line by adding a new string. So outside of the first string, you add a second string, And you can also put this into a new line here, just to really make it look more like a table. And there we could name this side, side, main, main, and add another row, so to say, with another string where we have the footer, 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 footer. So important, you need to end up with as many rows and columns as you have. So here we got 4 columns and 3 rows. If I now save this and reload, nothing changes. But now actually we defined areas. The first row is the header area. The second row has 2 areas, side and main. And the last row has a footer area. And now we can use these names with the grid area property. So now I can use header here because we got header up here too. And with that, if you reload, element 3 actually takes the full header. So this is really cool because now you don't have to go to the element and tell it where to start and end. You define names and labels for your grid up there. And if there is some element which you don't want to give a label or which you want to leave empty, you add a dot instead. So I replaced the 2 side labels with 2 dots. And now they won't have names. Now we can position element 2, and we can position it by commenting out our row and column shorthands. And let's say this should go into the main area. So now we can simply add grid area here, main. Again, no squared brackets or anything like that. Now it goes into the main area, and the other elements fill up the remaining space. Important here, by the way, you see that element 4 also is positioned prior to element 2, because with the grid area setting here, the DOM order actually is not respected anymore. So this is some trivia, something important to recognize at this point. If we give element 4 its own place, of course, by setting this grid area to footer, for example, then it will jump down there and this cell will remain empty. So working with grid areas is a really powerful tool which makes it very easy or much easier for us to define where in the grid what should be positioned. And this syntax can look really strange at the beginning, but especially when you write it like this, you can think of this as a table. You got 3 rows and each row has 4 columns. Just important, don't omit any values here. You have to end up with as many words or dots as you have cells in the final grid. So back in our theory grid, here we also added the grid areas the last time we worked on that. And don't forget that earlier, at the beginning of this module, I showed that under the Layout tab of the Firefox Developer Tools, you got that Display Area Names checkbox. Now, if you click it, here you can then also see the areas defined by you. So this can be really useful since this gives you an overview over which parts of your grid do have which name, just as a side note. However, in this video here, I also want to dive into something else related to areas and not related to 2 areas, but to line names again. Remember that earlier we set these names here on the rows. We didn't set names for columns because there we're using repeat. Now the obvious question is, how do you assign a line name here? Because this gets repeated. You can't set column 1 start. It will get repeated and you don't need 4 column 1 start lines, do you? Well, turns out you might need. So we can add a line name here in the repeat argument, in the second argument, just as we added in other places. We add squared brackets, and in the squared brackets here, we then assign the line name we have. Now, these are column line names, so let's maybe name it column start. I deliberately don't add a number here, so it's not column 1 start or anything like that, because that wouldn't really be helpful. It's in the end getting repeated. After this, I'll add column end though. So now I define column line names, and these line names will actually be repeated. Now, we're not using line names anymore, we're using the area, But let's switch back to line names and let's assign our remaining unassigned element, element 1, to a place in the grid with the help of line names. So here I will add my grid column property to use that shorthand. And now how could I tell this that I want to position it, let's say, in this empty box here, in this empty cell? It would start at column line 2 and end at column line 3, but we assigned a name, but the name is column start all the time. Well, if you repeat column names and you have the same name more than once, you can use column dash start here and then add the number of occurrence you want to start. So the first line here will actually be column start 1. The second one is column start 2. You don't add this as part of the name, but you simply add 2 as an extra value after the name. Then your forward slash and then, well, the point where you want to end. So column end, and here also the second occurrence, because the first column end will be line number 2 here, this vertical line. The second column end is this one. With that, if we save that and reload, this is now placed exactly where we wanted to place it. So you can use line names together with repeat. You just need to specify the number of occurrence, so to say. So which one of the automatically generated lines do you want to target? So this is one very nice thing. One other thing you might have noticed is that I always used dash start and dash end at the name. Now, it makes sense to use this because it clearly marks what the line is or where it is positioned, but it also yields one other benefit. We get automatically generated template areas if we follow the naming patterns of naming our lines with dash start or dash end. Let me show you what I mean. In our container, we got this first row, which has a height of 5 rem. Let's maybe rename it from row 1 start to HD start. HD for header. I'm not using header because I define it here and I want to show you that we create a new area here automatically. I'll name this then HD end, so after the value for the first row. And now let's also work on our template columns. Now, inside of the repeat function would be the wrong place because the pattern would then be repeated and I want to enclose all columns with a start and end line name, but I can simply add it in front and after repeat. So in square brackets, I can add HD start here too. And after the repeat function at the very end of this declaration, therefore, I will also add square brackets and add HD end. What this will give us is a named line or 2 named lines, one in front of the whole column set here and one after all the columns. It still also creates these line names in between, but we also get these outside of the repeat function. And we got the same line names for the first row. So for the first 2 row lines in the end. HD start for the first row line, HD end for the second. And it's no problem that some lines have duplicate or multiple names, I should say. So now we got HD start and HD end, and we clearly mark or enclose an area in the grid with that. We can now use this as an automatically generated area name, HD. So if we follow the pattern of having dash start or dash end after the name, then this name in front of dash start and dash end will become an automatically generated grid area, enclosing whatever you put between these lines. So now we can use HD as a name for our element 3. Right now we use header, that's the area we defined on our own. If I now change this to HD and save this, and keep in mind HD is not defined by us here, if we go back and reload, we have the same result as before, because we still occupy the full first row simply due to our setup here. Simply because we use this pattern. If I change one name, for example HD start to HD start, this is still a valid line name. We can name it like this. But if I reload, our layout breaks because now we're referencing an area, HD, which does not exist because it's not automatically generated because you have to follow that naming pattern of dash start and dash end at the end. So this is also useful to know. I'd argue that this approach of manually laying out the grid is easier to understand for your fellow developers, but it is good to know that you have the possibility of automatically inferring the grid area names or using these auto-generated grid areas.